Welcome, students, to the Middle Ages. We are in Unit 7, Section 1, going to be talking about the early Middle Ages. And the early Middle Ages starts from about 500 AD, and generally we say it goes until about 1000 AD. Now, this is not the entire Middle Ages. This is only the early part of the Middle Ages. In fact, as we go through, you're going to see in this periodization slide that the early Middle Ages goes from 500 to 1000, but then we have the High Middle Ages, which lasted about 250 years, 1000 to 1250 AD, to the Late Middle Ages, 1250 to 1500 AD. And so we'll be talking specifically about this time period here, the early Middle Ages. Again, in your notebooks, you should be writing Unit 7, Section 1, the early Middle Ages. And for us, we're going to be focusing on some major things. For our focus question for this unit, we're going to be asking the question, what controls people? Yeah, we know that government controls people, that family controls people, that military controls people, but what other things? What are other things that actually control people in their lives, in their beliefs, in their systems? And we can make a bunch of different opinions from that. Are these things good? Are they bad? Does it keep society structured? Does it not? But what controls people? Our first objective is going to be, how did the Germanic tribes gain power? You'll remember that in 476 AD, Western Rome fell, and in comes a huge amount of Germanic tribes, from the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, the Vandals, all sorts of Germanic tribes. We're going to be talking about how were they able to defeat and overtake one of the world's greatest empires of all time, the Romans. And what did they do with that? In Objective 2, we'll be asking the question, what legacy did Charlemagne create in Western Europe? Charlemagne is going to be probably the most heroic, most important figure in the Middle Ages. Although there are many, many other people, Charlemagne stands out as one of the most important people during the Middle Ages. In Objective 3, where are the key areas and empires in Western Europe? We want to understand, especially modern Europe today, but we want to understand how modern Europe came to be the way that it was. With all these questions and with all this we're going to be looking at, one thing that is tempting for historians and for people to do is to look at Rome and say this was a time period of huge economic success and intelligence and technology, and then they look at the Middle Ages and say that the Middle Ages is a time of regression. There is truth to this. There's no doubt about it. But we should be careful about saying that and over stipulating that. Many people call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, and again, there's truth that this is a time period where illiteracy rates will go up, technology will go away. However, the idea that we can't learn anything from these people and that they didn't contribute to our societies at all today is ludicrous. Some of our modern ideas of government and law come from the Middle Ages, including the idea of the sheriff, and different legal codes and punishments and criminal laws all come from the Middle Ages. So we want to be careful about that. Again, this is the periodization sheet of what the Middle Ages is. So if we say the Middle Ages, we're generally saying from the year 500 to about 1500. So about 1,000 years of time exists in the whole Middle Ages. But in this section, we'll be looking at specifically 500 to 1000 AD. So let's talk a little bit about the geography of Western Europe. You'll later have an activity where you're going to be actually looking at more of what Western Europe was and how it came to be. But let's just talk about just generally the geography of Western Europe. So first off, from about 500 to 1000 AD, Europe was cut off from the rest of the other civilizations, meaning through warfare, tribes, geographical boundaries, and other things like that, these people were isolated from the rest of the world. With time, Europe is going to blend into what we call the Greco-Roman era, meaning the Greeks and the Romans are going to have huge influence on the Germanic tribes. And eventually, the Germanic tribes are going to have a lot of Christian traditions also bleed into their civilization. These people were polytheistic and were paganist, and they'll go from that to monotheistic and believing in Jesus Christ. And so we see that the medieval society is specifically structured with this blending of these cultures. Now, we call it medieval because medieval literally means the middle of. So it's in the middle of Rome and what we call the Renaissance. And that's why it's called the medieval period. That was classified by historians. Let's talk a little bit more about the location of the Middle Ages and Western Europe. Europe is very small. It's the second smallest inland area of the 7 continents. Europe belongs to the continent with Eurasia, so Europe and Asia mixed together, and it is a very, very small area. Many of the states in Europe could fit into the modern-day states of the United States today. So to give you an idea of how small it is, you can fit Italy almost inside the state of Idaho. It's a pretty small area. You can travel to many, many countries in a very short order. And so here is a picture of Western Europe. So when we're talking about Europe, we're going to be mostly talking about from about this German area here, Germany, over west. And this is what classifies most of Western Europe here today. This is also Europe, but we won't be talking nearly as much about the Balkans or about any of Eastern European stuff like Russia or anything like that. We'll be focusing mostly on the western side here. And so let's talk a little bit about the resources that these people had. From about the early Middle Ages, most of this is not highly developed. It's not civilized. It doesn't have huge cities. Instead, it's made up mostly of what we call frontier. The frontier is a word we still use today all the time. It means land that's sparsely unpopulated and undeveloped. So you'll want to, for your definition, write that. It's not a very dense area with people, that is, or cities. It's densely in trees and other unpopulated, undeveloped areas, but it's not having a lot of people there. There are some large rivers, which are going to make it later ideal for a lot of trading, to trade resources from one tribe to another. We won't see that until a little bit later in the Middle Ages. So let's talk about these Germanic kingdoms for a second. The Germanic tribes were mostly farmers and herders. They were nomadic. They didn't have necessarily a place that they called home. So when we call them tribes, I know most of the time we think tribes and we think, Native Americans, and we think of the Cherokee or, other native groups like that. And we should, but these are just as much tribes as well. They are moving around. They are having their herds move for food, and they are moving around to have the best agricultural land. They're not staying placed for forever in one area. That will come later, but that's not happening now. They really had no major cities. There will be some cities that will develop later on, but no major cities are going to be there. And one of the big differences between Rome and the Middle Ages and these Germanic tribes is law. There are no written laws. Written laws are for people who can read, and most of the people in the Middle Ages cannot read. And so you will learn the laws that you must follow through different means, but they will not be written down for most people. They are going to live in small communities, and they're going to elect kings to lead them in these small tribes, and they will go to war with many of the other tribes trying to take resources and land and people and all sorts of other things. So here's another picture of the different Germanic tribes. In Spain, we have the Visigothic kingdom. We also have a group of people called the Basques, and the Basques still live in northeastern Spain today. We have the Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne will come from the Frankish kingdom, and modern-day France and Germany will come from this kingdom. We have the Burgundians. We have the Ostrogoths and the Lombards. We'll have the Saxons and the Celts, and we'll have the Vandals. Now, all of this is the Germanic tribes, and there's many more that we have not talked about. The Vandals, the Slavs, the Avars, all sorts of other groups. But we'll remember that just because in 476 AD Rome itself fell doesn't mean that the Roman Empire is gone. If you had talked to any of the people over here in Eastern Rome, centered in Constantinople, they would have called themselves Romans. We most of the time call them Byzantiums or the Byzantine Empire, but this group of people would have considered themselves Romans. And so here is Rome one solid empire, and you can see what happened to Western Rome, broken up into many different Germanic tribes who are all fighting each other. The Franks are going to be one of the major groups that we're going to talk about, partly because Charlemagne comes from the Frankish tribe. And they're going to take over most of what we call France into northern Italy and into Germany, modern-day Germany today. And they are incredibly influential in this way. So let's talk a little bit more about the Franks. The Franks in our early Middle Age period are going to be about from the year 400 to 700 AD. And this tribe is going to come into Western Europe, and they're going to be into small kingdoms. The strongest of those kingdoms was specifically the Franks. And they're really going to be established by a very important king called King Clovis in 486 AD. He is the king of the Franks, and he's going to conquer Gaul, which I know, Gaul doesn't make a lot of sense today. You've never heard probably where Gaul is. But again, Gaul would have been in this modern-day French area here. This would have been Gaul. You can see the Seine River and the Loire River here. Both would have been in Gaul. And so Clovis is probably one of the most important kings early on in the Frankish Empire as he really starts to unite the Franks together. Now, Europe has one major enemy, not the Romans, but in fact the Muslims. The Muslims have been dominating Spain. They started over in the Arabian Desert and moved over to North Africa and eventually took over Spain with the plan to keep going into Europe. But they're not able to get past Spain into Gaul or France today. And a major part of that is because of the Franks. The Franks changed Europe and changed the way that the Muslims were building their empire. They kind of were a force that stopped the empire. Hey, can I call you back? Thanks. The religion of Islam is going to appear in 622 AD and going to be very, very quick to move and grow and going to really take over huge amounts of area. In fact, the Islamic Empire will be nearly as large as the Roman Empire and will last just as long. One of the most important Frankish leaders that helped stop the advancement of the Muslims through Spain is going to be a man named Charles Martel. Charles Martel is a very important person as he is the grandfather to Charlemagne. And Charles is known as the warrior of the Franks. Why? Because in 732 AD, he defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Tours. And the Battle of Tours is in that Gaul area in the northwestern part of France. We'll see where that is here in a minute. But Charles Martel stopped the advancement of these Muslims going into France today. And so to Europeans who are Christians, the Muslims were unbelieving infidels who were hostile. They were not a group of people to be respected. They were not a group of people to really engage with or try to have relations with. And so if we look here at this map, we can see here's the Battle of Tours. This is modern day France. So in the northwestern side of France, we can see the Battle of Tours happening. You can see here is the Muslim Empire coming in through North Africa, up through Spain, and trying to come into the rest of Europe. But Charles Martel and the Frankish Empire will stop them here on the border of France and Spain. Muslims had conquered Arabia. They had conquered the Middle East, which is this area here. And they had all conquered through North Africa and were well on their way to trying to take over the European area here, basically taking over the old Roman world. But because Charles is there, he's able to stop them. And so he is seen as a hero by many, many, many people at this time as well as today. Well, Charlemagne's going to come through this line. And Charlemagne is the son of a man named Pepin. Charlemagne's family is kind of funny. They like to name one son Pepin, the next one Charles, and then they keep doing that. Pepin, Charles, Pepin, Charles, Pepin, Charles. So Charlemagne's actual names would have been Charles. In fact, he's called Charles the Great many times. And Pepin, as his father, will die, and this will give Charlemagne an opportunity to have the throne. And I'll tell you why it's an opportunity. The problem with the Franks is that Pepin had two sons. He had Charles, this is Charlemagne, and he had Carloman. Now, these two not necessarily hated each other, but anybody that was going to have two sons in their, and if they're king, is going to have a problem on their hands. And that is that they are going to immediately go to war with one another and fight one another. And so Charles and Carloman are going to be competing for the kingdom of the Franks. And who will get it? Well, we know Charlemagne will, Charles will. Carloman he dies. It's mysterious. He is poisoned. Nobody knows who killed him. Some point and say that Charlemagne did to make sure that he would get the throne. There's not necessarily evidence that really specifically points this out, but it would make sense that Charlemagne would want his brother to go away. Whatever happened, Carloman dies, which gives Charles the opportunity to be the king of the Franks. Now, Charlemagne, one of the greatest things that he does is he's going to hire a secretary named Inhard. And Inhard is going to have one job at first, and that is going to be recording Charlemagne's life, his actions, his deeds. And so part of the reason Charlemagne is so famous is that we know more about him than many other people, because Inhard was recording all of his actions and his deeds. There may be many other people we would know about, but we don't because nobody recorded their information. So that's going to be an important thing for us to understand Charlemagne and the Franks. So if we look at Charlemagne, in about 800, he took Western Europe and he started to unify it. Again, Charlemagne is the grandson of Charles Martel, so he's already coming from a family line that is very famous. Charlemagne will be known as the grandson of the man who defeated the Muslims. But what's really interesting is Charlemagne not only is related to a famous grandfather, he becomes himself very, very famous and very important to the Middle Ages. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, is going to spend 46 years of his reign doing what his grandfather did, and that will be fighting the Muslims in Spain. He'll also fight the Saxons in the north, the Avars and the Slavs in the east, and the Lombards in Italy. Specifically, he'll actually help fight the Lombards off from the Pope in Rome, and will get a pretty prestigious title, which we'll talk about here in the future. But this is Charles, or Charlemagne. Charlemagne is, without a doubt, one of the most famous men in the Middle Ages that there could be. His conquests did reunite much of the old Roman Empire and will give rise to what we call the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this gets a little complicated. There is the Roman Empire, and then there's the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, Rome is existing, clear back 1,000, 1,500 years BC, and goes all the way until 476 AD, where Western Rome falls, and then Eastern Rome falls in the 15th century AD. The Holy Roman Empire is not either of those two. The Holy Roman Empire is going to come after the fall of Western Rome, and as Charles or Charlemagne reunites much of the old Roman Empire. So first off, he becomes a Christian emperor, which is a really big deal because many of the Germanic tribes are going to be primarily Christian. So how does he become the Christian emperor? Well, in 800, Pope Leo III called on Charlemagne to help him stop rebellious nobles and the Lombards from coming into Rome and taking over, basically, the Pope and the Catholic Church. Charlemagne is a devout Catholic. He is very, very noble and very loyal to the Pope. And so he'll go. And when he goes and defeats these Germanic tribes and these nobles from coming into Rome, he's going to be crowned by the Pope as the German or the Emperor of Rome. Now this is significant. Here we have Pope Leo crowning Charlemagne. And that's a really big deal because if the Pope, who is supposed to be the mouthpiece of God, is saying this man is the Emperor of Rome, then that gives a lot of clout to his title. And so he is going to have the backing of the church. Many other Germans are going to be jealous of this, upset about this, but there's no doubt that some people will have to reverence the idea that Charlemagne is the new emperor because the Pope himself crowned Charlemagne. Now this is important because this shows you a couple things. One, how important Charlemagne is, but two, it also demonstrates how powerful the Catholic Church was at this time period. While the Catholic Church is not making laws and dictating what everyone is doing at this point in time in the Middle Ages, it is definitely making political and government decisions that will have huge and long-lasting impacts. And nonetheless, Charlemagne is crowned by Pope Leo, and not just crowned, but actually crowned on Christmas Day, which is also significant, that on the day that Christ was born, Charlemagne is also being crowned the king. So the Lombards are going to invade Italy, like I said, and going after the Pope, and Charlemagne will once again be called upon and will defeat the Lombards, making it so that way he is the defender of the faith. This is actually what Charlemagne means defender of the faith. And he will be very successful in defeating the Lombards in Pavia, which is in northern Italy. Charles helped the Pope and defeated the Lombards, and in return the Pope had a tremendous amount of loyalty to Charlemagne. So on Christmas Day, like I said, 800 AD, the Pope crowns Charlemagne. He becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. This is going to be known as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and this is this is his actual crown. We still have it today. It is priceless. It has tremendous amount of precious stones and gold in it, but it's also the historical significance that gives it so much worth. By doing this, the Pope revived this idea that a united Christian church should be dominant. Just like Rome was united in Christianity, so the Germanic tribes should be united in Christianity. Now this is going to be said, and this is going to be kind of thought, but it's not going to necessarily happen. Charlemagne will fight to unify the Christians under one rule, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be unified. It takes a long time. Charlemagne helps widen the split between Western and what we call Eastern Rome. Eastern Romans in Constantinople are going to feel like, who the heck is Pope Leo that is deciding who the king is of Western Rome? He can't do that. There's already an emperor. He's in Eastern Rome, in Constantinople. And so we'll see that Eastern and Western Rome are going to get further and further split. And again, I'm saying Western Rome, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now the Holy Roman Empire. So understand that those are two different times and two different groups. So let's talk a little bit about the government that Charlemagne sets up. Part of the reason that Charlemagne is so successful is he's going to try to exercise control over many different groups of people, and he's going to have them try to be unified under what we call a Christian Europe. He helps spread Christianity not through necessarily traditional missionary work, but through conquering people. He's going to militarily come in and he's going to say, hey, you're Christians, right? And he's going to set up monasteries and cathedrals that people can worship at and that people can learn at. And much of the law and much of the things that will be taught to the people will be done not at a government building, but actually at the church, which gives the church tremendous power. He appoints powerful nobles to rule in local regions, making it so that he has tremendous loyalty because he's giving these nobles land and wealth and money as long as they are willing to support him and defend him militarily. To control these rulers and these nobles, he sent out different officials called Missae Dominicae, which these men were basically scribes or secretaries or viziers like we've talked about in the past. And their job was to go and check on roads, listen to the different grievances from the different areas, and to make sure that justice was being established, that people weren't being taken advantage of. So this is what I'm talking about. This is, we can see, a great time period of control and law. These people aren't just wandering and have no direction, especially under Charlemagne. They have a very structured, organized group that is going out and doing a fairly good job. Charlemagne is going to have really good control over his empire. Charlemagne is also going to do something that's going to be very, very important, especially since Western Rome fell. He's going to bring back a revival of learning. Now, a lot of this is going to be because he wants to make his court or his kingdom a second Rome. He recognizes that Western Rome fell. He recognizes that Rome was a great time period of success and technology. He wants to make his empire that way. And so he really encourages learning in a major way. He's going to revive Latin in his empire. Now, Latin has always kind of been seen as a prestigious language. It's the language that the learned people know. Other languages like English or German or other things like that are going to be seen as not as intelligent language. If you know Latin, you're an educated person. Even today, we look at people who speak Latin as being educated. And so he's going to revive Latin back into his empire. He himself can't speak it at first and will not be able to master it ever, but he will bring back the Latin into his empire to try to teach it to his people. He's going to also find a school, and he's going to have a scholar named Alcuin. Alcuin is going to be a scholar, and he's going to create curriculum. When I say curriculum, we also use this word all the time, and we mean it the same way, formal course of study. So make sure you have your curriculum done for history, formal course of study. Alcuin will set the school up and will set this curriculum up for people to become educated. Most of where Charlemagne is going to set up his stuff is going to be in the capital, Aachen. And here we can see a map of what Charlemagne would have lived in and what his area would have looked like. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but we start to see the reemergence of kind of a city. And so we start seeing, again, the reemergence of Roman kind of ideals and beliefs. Now, not to the level of Rome, but we are going to start to see it coming back. So Charlemagne is going to die in 814 AD. After this, his empire, sadly, is going to fall apart fairly quickly. And the question is why? Why was he such a linchpin to the whole Frankish Empire? And a major part of that is his sons. He is going to have many sons who are all going to battle for the next 30 years trying to take over each other's areas. Charlemagne himself will split the empire into three, giving each of his sons areas and land. But instead of working together and being united, they're going to fight for 30 years against each other. So in 843, Charlemagne's grandsons drew up what was called the Treaty of Verdun. It's going to split the empire, like I said, into three regions, and it's going to have each grandson owning each of the region. Here we have the three kingdoms. The kingdom of Charles, this would have been the oldest son, and he had the area of what was traditionally the Frankish Empire, Gaul and whatnot. Then we had the kingdom of Lothair. Lothair owned Aachen, where Charlemagne lived, and owned this German area today down into Italy, which was important because the Catholic Church was homed in Rome. And we also have the kingdom of Louis. This is going to be important because Louis is going to be an important person and name into modern day France. There's many King Louis that all will stem from this. And he's going to be in charge of the eastern part of the Frankish Empire. And so we can see that here we have most of Western Rome, but instead of being unified like it was under Charlemagne, it's going to instead be split into three groups. And instead of working together, they will fight each other trying to get control. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Charlemagne. What did he leave? Like, yes, he made an empire, but he died. So what did he leave? What's his legacy? Well, number one, he extended Christianity to all the civilizations. He took all these different Germanic tribes and he made them unified in Christianity and the blending of their cultures. We're going to see many people that are Germanic taking their cultural, their heritage, their traditions, and not getting rid of them, but adjusting them to Christianity. This is going to account for why Christmas is in December and not in the spring, because pagans would have been celebrating many of their holidays in the winter solstice in December. And if you could take Christ's birth and combine it with a holiday that pagans are already worshiping, pagans will be much more happy to become Christians as long as they get to keep celebrating their holidays. He's going to set up a strong and efficient government. Specifically, we know he set up the Missa Dominici, which gave him tremendous power. But after Charlemagne and his grandsons fighting and killing each other, we're going to see tremendous threats upon his empire. A new wave of invasions are going to happen and occur. Number one, the Muslims. With not having such a strong force, Muslims are going to come in and continually threaten the Frankish Empire. Also in 896, the Magyars are going to push through Eastern Europe. The Magyars are the modern day people in Hungary. In fact, some people jokingly say that the reason Hungary is called Hungary is because when the Magyars came through, they destroyed and took everything so quickly and so much that they were very hungry. Now, that's not most likely true, but people jokingly say that because the Magyars were such a fierce group of people who came through and will be a major force that the Franks have a very difficult time trying to control. But perhaps the most famous and the last group that we'll talk about is the Vikings. The Vikings are going to challenge the unity of Charlemagne. You know much about the Vikings from just videos you've watched or things that you've learned about, but the Vikings are going to come and they're going to challenge this unity of Charlemagne's empire. They're going to be traders, explorers, but mostly that we remember them as is destructive raiders. My family actually owned an isle called the Isle of Bute in Scotland, where they were supposed to try to stop the Vikings from coming into the rest of England and Ireland and rest of Europe. You can see how well they did. They get destroyed and get really, they get their butts kicked. And so they opened up these trading routes and linked much of northern Europe with the Mediterranean lands. So now we start seeing many of the northern European countries like Denmark and Norway being linked to the rest of mainland Europe. However, the Vikings are not doing this through mostly trade and peace. They're doing this through raids and destruction. And we know that specifically from the Vikings, Leif Erikson will come and will live and will set up a very short-lived colony in North America. Many people argue he may have been one of the first people in North America. That can be argued. But we do see that the Vikings are going to be a very influential group of people. We won't take the time to talk about them now because we're talking about the Middle Ages and Europeans, but it should be understood that the Vikings became one of the most influential groups to the Europeans that there could have been. And so that's the end of the notes here. Let's just make sure that we've got our objectives all answered before we finish off. First and foremost, in our focus question we asked what controls people, and hopefully you see again, yes, same things that we've seen in the past. Military, yes, government. But one thing that we haven't really discussed or looked at is, and this will be very important in the Middle Ages, is the church, Christianity. Christianity and the church will control people in huge amounts, from dictating who is going to be the Roman emperor to telling people what they should be doing every day. And you'll learn more about that in section 3. How do the Germanic tribes gain power? Well, if we look, we can see that there's not much structure and there's not much going on in the early Middle Ages. There is, we talked about frontier, and with frontier there is very sparsely populated and undeveloped, which allowed people to come in and take over. Also, these large rivers were able to let them get places very quickly. Germanic tribes were able to move and fight each other and take over these areas very, very quickly. Specifically, the Franks were able to take over because of their fierce battles, like Charles Martel's and the Battle of Tours in 732, and also their ability to, with Charlemagne, create an education and set up, number one, set up an education system, and number two here, be crowned by the Pope himself, Pope Leo III. Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne, which allows him to be able to take over Western Europe. And so those are the answers to that objective, objective 2. And then objective 3, where are the key areas and empires in Western Europe? What I really want you to know there is, I just want you guys to know, and this will be really mostly answered with the activity you do, the European map activity. What I'm wanting you to know is, what are the modern day areas today? So Spain, France, Germany, who took these areas over, and mostly the Franks. And so really wait to answer objective 3 until you finish your map activity. Your map activity will be glued into your notebook at the end of this section, and you can just put off to the side of that objective 3, and that'll be the answer to that, because it'll help you understand much of Western Europe. That is it for the early Middle Ages. If you have questions or anything like that, please Adelio me or email me or Unify Classroom message me. Either way will work for me. Thanks.